War. War never changes.
You some kind of war junkie?
Gentlemen, you can't fight in here. This is the war room.
Welcome to the War 102 podcast, where we explore the doctrine, theory, philosophy, and history of warfare. I'm your guide, Paul Darling, and I want to share what I learned in nearly 30 years in uniform. So let's get to learning about the most influential activity in human history, war.
Welcome to episode 103, the American Campaign in the Solomon Islands. Solomon Islands campaign is one of the most consequential and tactically instructive episodes of the Second World War, and this episode is a specific request from a listener. So thank you for giving me something to do. The campaign stretched from the desperate improvisation of Operation Watchtower in 1942, and then ended up with a more methodical execution of Operation Cartwheel the next year, and finally the contest in Bougainville in 1944. The campaign required the United States to learn, adapt, and ultimately master a form of combined arms warfare for which it was unprepared. What began as a reactive scramble to deny Japan a strategic airfield became a sustained operational campaign that shattered Japanese air and naval power in the South Pacific, neutralized the fortress at Rabaul, and opened the road to the Philippines. The story of how American ground, naval, and air forces accomplished that transformation is truly a story about figuring it out under fire. The genesis of the Solomons campaign lay in the collision of two competing strategic visions. Following the American victories at Coral Sea and Midway in 1942, Japan's capacity for large-scale offensive action was degraded, and American planners recognized an opportunity to seize the initiative. General Douglas MacArthur, commanding the Southwest Pacific area, advocated a bold, direct lunge towards Rabaul, the sprawling Japanese naval and air base on New Britain that served as the hub of Tokyo's South Pacific power. The Navy was more cautious about the risks of such an extension and favored a methodical advance northward towards the Solomon Island chain. This tension between audacity and attrition would shadow American decision-making throughout the campaign. The compromise brokered by Admiral King and General Marshall established a three-phased approach. First, the seizure of Tulagi and the southern Solomons. Second, an advance along the New Guinea coast. And finally, a convergence on Rabaul itself. The directive issuing from the Joint Chiefs on July 2, 1942, set this framework in motion. What the planners could not appreciate, however, was that the Southern Solomons, and Guadalcanal in particular, would consume 6 months of brutal attritional struggle before the campaign could even progress to the next stage. The landings of August 7, 1942 on Guadalcanal, Tulagi, and Florida Island represented the first offensive amphibious operation the United States Navy had undertaken in the Pacific. And the seams in American doctrine and preparation showed immediately. The Marines of Major General Alexander Vandegrift's 1st Division came ashore with insufficient supplies, incomplete intelligence, and naval transport commanders who are already a little anxious about Japanese counterattacks. Within 2 days, Rear Admiral Frank Fletcher withdrew his carrier force, citing fuel concerns and the vulnerability of his ships to land-based air. The Marines were left to hold a perimeter around the half-finished Japanese airstrip, soon named Henderson Field, with diminishing ammunition and food. The operational logic of Henderson Field was the key to understanding everything that followed. Whoever controlled that airstrip controlled the daylight hours over the surrounding waters. American aviators flying a mixed collection of Marine Corps, Navy, and Army Air Forces aircraft established what became known informally as the Cactus Air Force, a ragged but relatively effective defense anchored to the field's dirt runway. Land-based Japanese pilots flying from Rabaul faced a punishing round trip of roughly 1,200 miles, which robbed them of loiter time and fuel reserves at the moment of combat, similar to how the German forces were restricted during the Battle of Britain. American fighters scrambled from Henderson enjoyed the defenders' advantage of fighting close to home and relatively unlimited loiter compared to its enemy. This tactical asymmetry defined the daylight contest for Guadalcanal, but the nights belonged to Japan and Michelob. The Imperial Japanese Navy had invested heavily in night surface warfare, and its crews were superbly trained in torpedo attack and low-light maneuvering. The result was a nighttime rhythm that American naval commanders found unsettling. Japanese destroyers and cruisers would race down the channel between the islands, a passage that would earn the name the Slot, deliver troops and supplies to Guadalcanal under darkness, and retire before dawn, place them within reach of Henderson's aircraft. The Americans could not effectively challenge this pattern in the early months, and their attempts to do so resulted in some of the worst defeats the United States Navy has ever suffered. The Battle of Savo Island on the night of August 8th, 1942, was the most catastrophic. A Japanese cruiser force under Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa exploited poor American radar discipline and overconfident picket dispositions, and they sank 4 Allied heavy cruisers in less than 40 minutes. The tactical dimensions of the failure were instructive. American commanders had not adequately accounted for Japanese night fighting proficiency, had not coordinated their radar picket arrangements effectively, and allowed the fighting efficiency of their task group to degrade in the exhausting days following the initial landings. The lessons learned here would be expensive, but they would at least be learned. The months that followed Savo Island forced American naval and ground commanders into a continuous cycle of tactical innovation. On Guadalcanal itself, the Marines constructed a defensive perimeter around Henderson Field and developed an intimate understanding of Japanese tactical patterns. Japanese commanders repeatedly launched frontal infantry assaults against the Marine lines, often at night and often following a predictable sequence of naval bombardment. The Marines met these attacks with a coordinated artillery, machine gun, and aggressive willingness to exploit the enemy's disregard for the value of fire superiority. As arrogant as the U.S. Navy was of Japanese night fighting abilities, the Japanese Army was equally as arrogant in disregarding the Marines' valor and ability to withstand repeated attacks. This destruction of the Ichiki detachment of the Tanaro River and the repulse of Major General Kiyotake Kawaguchi's brigade at Bloody Ridge in September demonstrated that well-sited American defensive positions could absorb Japanese attacks at enormous cost to the attacker. American naval performance improved more slowly, but with equal consequence. Commanders like Rear Admiral Norman Scott began developing tactical procedures for night engagements that made better use of radar. At the Battle of Cape Esperance in October, Scott's cruiser-destroyer force ambushed a Japanese bombardment group, demonstrating that American ships could fight effectively at night when properly organized and briefed. The learning was uneven. The disastrous Battle of Tassafaronga in November showed that the Japanese torpedo crews could devastate a numerically superior American surface force under the right conditions, but the overall trajectory was towards competence on the American side. The air campaign's decisive turning point came in the naval battle of Guadalcanal in November of 1942. Over several days of extraordinary, intense fighting, American surface forces, including battleships under Rear Admiral Willis Lee and shore-based aircraft from Henderson, combined to defeat Japan's final serious efforts to land heavy reinforcements and bombard the airfield into uselessness. One Japanese officer later reflected that this engagement was the turning point, and the metaphor was apt. Japan could no longer sustain the attrition of fighting for Guadalcanal, and in February 1943 evacuated the remnants of its garrison. The campaign had cost Japan approximately 31,000 men, 38 warships, and 683 aircraft. Losses it could replace in material terms, but never fully recover from air crew quality and naval experience. With Guadalcanal secured, American planners confronted the next phase of the campaign with considerably more institutional knowledge than they had possessed in 1942. The framework that emerged, Operation Cartwheel, launched in June 1943, represented a decisive step forward in operational sophistication. Its logic was essentially that of encirclement rather than frontal reduction. Rather than battering through each Japanese-held island in the Solomons chain sequentially at great cost, Halsey's forces would advance by selective amphibious assault, seizing positions that enabled air coverage of the next objective while bypassing or isolating garrisons that could be left to wither without resupply. The New Georgia campaign, which opened on June 30, 1943, with the capture of Rendova Island as a preliminary base for the assault on Munda Airfield, illustrated both the progress and the remaining limitations of American amphibious warfare. The seizure of Rendova, chosen precisely because coral reefs presented large ships from approaching Munda Point directly, demonstrated improved operational planning. Rendova placed American artillery within range of the target airfield, providing fire support for the subsequent landings on New Georgia proper. The campaign also saw an important interoperability experiment as the Royal Navy carrier HMS Victorious, yet again demonstrating they always have the best names, operated alongside USS Saratoga, not bad, to provide carrier air cover for the amphibious force. Yet New Georgia also exposed the persistent challenges of jungle warfare. The 43rd Infantry Division which bore the initial burden of fighting through the island's dense terrain, struggled against fortified Japanese positions and the physical and psychological toll of operating in conditions that caused the breakdown of unit cohesion at an alarming rate. It required the commitment of additional Army divisions and a change in the ground commander. Major General Oscar Griswold replacing an earlier commander at a critical juncture before the Munda airfield finally fell on August 5, 1943. The experience reinforced the importance of trained, acclimated troops, robust logistics, and the continuous pressure that prevented the Japanese from consolidating their defenses. The next move demonstrated a maturing operational creativity. Rather than assaulting the heavily garrisoned island of Kolombangara, where Japanese forces had been reinforced after the fall of Munda, Halsey elected to bypass it entirely and land instead at Vella La Vella in the northwest. This maneuver, executed on August 15th, placed American forces in a position that rendered Kolombangara strategically irrelevant. The Japanese eventually evacuated it rather than defend a position that served no purpose. The decision to bypass Kolombangara and later the far larger decision to bypass Rabaul, altogether in favor of neutralization, reflected an operational intelligence that had been mostly absent in the hasty planning of Watchtower only 14 months earlier. The invasion of Bougainville on November 1, 1943, was the campaign's culminating operation and probably its most operationally elegant. Halsey's planner chose the lightly defended Cape Torquena at Empress Augusta Bay rather than the obvious landing sites near Japan's major bases at Buen and Kahili in the south. The logic was indirect. American forces did not need to destroy the Japanese garrison on Bougainville. They needed only to seize enough ground to construct airfields from which Rabaul could be systematically neutralized. The 3rd Marine Amphibious Corps under Vandegrift, the same officer who had the improvised defense of Guadalcanal 15 months earlier, landed 14,000 men and proceeded to do exactly that. Japanese counterattacks at sea were repulsed in the Battle of Empress Augusta Bay, and by the end of November, a functional perimeter had been established from which the American engineers began constructing the airfields that would make Rabaul untenable. Halsey's subsequent strike on Rabaul itself, using carrier aviation to neutralize the base's air defenses, demonstrated the operational reach that American forces had developed. Japan attempted to reinforce Rabaul's air umbrella by transferring hundreds of carrier aircraft from fleet carriers at Truk, a decision that proved catastrophic when Allied raids destroyed between 200 and 300 of these aircraft, and more importantly, the experienced aviators flying them. Japan's pilot training pipeline could not replace such losses. The Solomon Campaign produced several durable lessons that American planners would carry forward through the remainder of the Pacific War. First, the campaign affirmed the indispensability of land-based air power as the foundation of any sustained operation in island or littoral environments. Henderson Field's survival had been the operational linchpin of the entire Guadalcanal struggle. Every subsequent advance in the Solomons was organized around the imperative of securing airfield sites. Second, the campaign demonstrated that American forces could learn and adapt under continuous operational pressure, converting the night fighting defeats of 1942 into the confident destroyer operations of 1943 and 44. Third, and perhaps most importantly, Cartwheel established the logic of the bypass as a legitimate and often superior alternative to direct assault. The decision to isolate rather than capture Rabaul trapped over 100,000 Japanese troops in a position from which they could threaten nothing and contribute nothing to Japan's strategic defense. The human cost was immense on both sides. The Solomon campaign consumed some 7,100 American lives and 29 ships, but the operational harvest was decisive. Japanese sea and air power in the South Pacific had been broken, the logistical backbone of their forward defense had been severed, and the road to the Philippines lay open. What had begun as a desperate improvisation on a jungle airstrip had become, through very painful institutional learning, the model for American power projection across the Pacific. I am forced to spend a little bit more time on the Marines now. On a personal note, my 2 sons, who reached 18, enlisted in the Army Infantry, and one is out, one's still serving. But my daughter has made the decision to enlist in the Marines, and I got to swear her in last week. So I can't be so parochial when it comes to which service I give the most lip service to. I got to get smarter on the Marines. So just wanted to brag a little bit on my kids. They're doing great. And my thanks to all the listeners and subscribers who came back and gave me some ideas for future episodes. I appreciate it, and I will integrate those into upcoming episodes. Thanks again. I'll talk to you later.
Thanks for listening today. If you want to help the show, please share today's episode on any social media sites you can. Check out the War 102 Buzzsprout website for more information and to send me a message. And, of course, my thanks to the subscribers who help keep the show going. Hope you all join me next week. See you soon.